I was 34 when I arrived in Fairhaven, thinking I was simply moving to a new town. In truth, I was running from a life that had quietly fallen apart over the previous months. A marriage that ended without shouting. Just that strange feeling of two people who'd simply stopped existing in the same world. My daughter and I hit the road on a cloudy March morning with the trunk too full and my heart too light for someone who was supposed to be sad. Back then, I couldn't explain that lightness. Today, I understand it. Some changes start as running away, but end up becoming an arrival. Before I keep going, let me ask you something simple. If you like stories that feel like a conversation between friends, the kind you tell looking someone straight in the eye, hit subscribe right here on the channel. And down in the comments, tell me, have you ever ignored a warning that turned out to be exactly the right thing to do? I always wonder how many of you have a story like that too. Okay. Now let me take you back to the day it all began. My name is Claire. I'm 34. I have a 9-year-old daughter named Laura, and a strange kind of skill for rebuilding my own life whenever it falls apart. It's not courage. It's more a mix of stubbornness and survival instinct. I've always been a teacher, always loved teaching, and when a position opened up at Horizon Elementary in Fairhaven, I took it without a second thought. It was one of those small towns where everyone knows who you are before you've even finished parking the car. I imagined my life would be quieter there. Fairhaven had that kind of calm beauty you only notice after a few minutes of looking around. Tree-lined streets, old houses with wide porches, a town square with a white church that looked frozen in time. When I brought Laura to see the school for the first time, she gripped my hand with that quiet curiosity kids have when they're trying to look brave. I was trying to look brave too. Inside, honestly, I had no idea if I was making the right decision. The school was bigger than I'd imagined. Well-kept gardens, wide hallways, and that new notebook smell that always gives me a sense of a fresh start. Laura walked into the classroom a little shy, but it only took a few minutes for a fair-haired girl to come sit next to her. The two of them started talking like they'd known each other for months. I stood watching from the doorway while the teacher got the kids settled. That small friendship blooming right there, so effortlessly, was the first thing that let me breathe a little easier that day. When class ended, I went to wait for Laura at the gate. Parents were chatting in little clusters, a few mothers were trading notes about school activities, and I was still trying to get a feel for the town's rhythm. That's when a black car pulled up in front of the gate. It wasn't a flashy car, but it caught attention the way everyone glanced discreetly in the same direction at once. That kind of thing always says more about a person than any formal introduction ever could. The woman who stepped out of the car had a presence that was hard to explain. Tall, elegant posture, blonde hair pulled into a simple bun that looked like it had been done in a hurry. There was nothing showy about her, but it was still impossible not to notice her. She walked up to the gate calmly, like someone used to being watched. The girl who'd been talking with Laura ran straight over to hug her. That's when I realized she was my daughter's new friend's mother. Laura came running up right behind her, way too excited for someone who'd just finished her first day at a new school. "Mom, this is Sophie," she said, pulling her new friend by the hand. The two of them started talking at once, mixing up stories about class, the teacher, and a group project they'd apparently already decided to do together. The blonde woman watched it all with a quiet smile, but there was something cautious in the way she took in her surroundings. We exchanged a polite greeting, the quick kind that happens when two mothers are trying to keep up with their daughter's excitement. "Anne," she said, offering her hand kindly. "Claire," I answered. It was a simple exchange, nothing that would explain the odd silence I noticed right after. A few people near the gate pretended to keep chatting, but it was obvious they were paying attention to that brief introduction. When Anne and Sophie got in the car and drove off, one of the mothers standing near me made a comment, low but loud enough to hear. "You'd better be careful." I looked at her, not understanding. She tilted her head toward the street where the car had disappeared. "That's the mayor's ex-wife." She paused briefly before finishing the thought. "And in this town, Nobody gets close to her by accident. I could say I ignored the comment. That would be the elegant answer, the mature one, almost heroic. But the truth is, I got curious, because sometimes life changes exactly at the moment someone tells you to keep your distance. And on that first day in Fairhaven, while my daughter chattered excitedly about her new friend, I had no idea that woman, the mayor's ex-wife, was about to become a much bigger part of my life than any warning from this town could have predicted. In the first few days after that comment at the school gate, I tried to act like it hadn't been rattling around in my head. Fairhaven was too small to completely ignore the stories that circulated through its streets, but I also hadn't come there to get tangled up in dramas that weren't mine. My priority was simple: new job, new house, new routine for me and Laura. Still, every time I pulled up to the school gate in the afternoon, my eyes kept searching, without meaning to, for that black car. Laura, on the other hand, didn't seem the least bit worried about any kind of grown-up drama. For her, life in Fairhaven had already gotten off to the best possible start, because she'd made a friend on day one. She and Sophie started sitting together in class, eating lunch together in the cafeteria, and apparently had already decided they were inseparable. It was funny to watch how kids build bonds without needing any complicated explanation. They just like each other, and that's enough. It was on a Wednesday that I really ran into Anne again for the second time. I was waiting for Laura at the gate, distracted, watching the street, when I heard Sophie calling her mom with that typical excitement of a kid just out of class. When I looked up, Anne was walking toward the gate again. She was wearing a simple white shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of sunglasses pushed up on top of her head. Nothing about her looked calculated, but there was still a natural elegance that made some people look twice. Laura came out right behind Sophie, dragging her backpack and talking so fast it seemed like she had to get it all out before she forgot half the story. "Mom, we have a science project," she announced, already coming toward me. Sophie finished the sentence before Laura could continue. "And the teacher said we can work in pairs." The two of them exchanged a quick look that left no doubt about which decision they'd already made. Anne and I looked at each other at the same moment, almost like two people who already knew exactly what was coming. "They've already decided, haven't they?" she asked with a small smile. I laughed. Apparently so. Laura took my hand and started explaining the details of the project with such seriousness. It was like she was presenting at an international science conference. Meanwhile, Sophie looked at her mother, waiting for approval. Anne paused briefly before answering. "If it's okay with your mom, you can go over to Laura's on Saturday to work on it." I raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised. Actually, I was thinking the same thing. That made both girls celebrate like they'd just won a prize. They immediately started arguing over who would bring what for the project, while Anne and I stood there trying to keep up with their rapid-fire planning. That's when I noticed something curious. Talking to Anne was surprisingly easy. There was no exaggerated formality, none of that cold distance I'd expected after hearing the town's comments about her. She seemed calm, attentive to her daughter, and far more interested in the girls' excitement than in the people around us. Still, there was one detail hard to ignore. Every time someone passed by the gate, their eyes drifted quickly back toward us. While the girls kept discussing the science project, Anne tilted her head slightly toward the street. "You're new in town, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. "Got here 2 weeks ago." She made a small, understanding gesture. Fairhaven takes a while to get used to new faces. The way she said it carried a light touch of irony, like she was describing something she knew all too well. Before I could answer, Laura tugged at my sleeve. "Mom, can Sophie really come Saturday?" I looked at Anne. She shrugged lightly. "If you don't mind." I smiled. "Of course not." It was a simple, natural decision, the kind that happens without you realizing it might carry bigger consequences. At that moment, to me, it was just a school project between two 9-year-old girls. When we said goodbye and went our separate ways down the street, Laura started talking excitedly about how fun Sophie was and how they'd decided to build a model for the science project. I listened to half the conversation while I drove, but my mind kept drifting back to that small exchange at the school gate. There was nothing extraordinary about it, just two mothers arranging a school project for their daughters. Still, something had shifted. Maybe it was just the feeling that, for the first time since we'd arrived in town, I didn't feel completely out of place. Or maybe it was that comment still echoing in my memory. "You'd better be careful." I didn't know exactly why, but that night, while Laura sketched out ideas for the science project at the kitchen table, I started to suspect that warning from the town might not be as simple as it seemed. And oddly enough, the more I thought about it, the less I wanted to obey it. Saturday came faster than I expected. Maybe because Laura had spent the whole week talking about the science project like it was the most important event in human history. She'd already set out cardboard boxes, tempera paint, colored paper, and an absurd amount of glue spread across the kitchen table. I looked at that organized chaos and thought about how simple life can seem through a child's eyes. Sophie arrived a little after 10 in the morning. Anne parked in front of our house and got out with her daughter. It was the first time she'd seen the place where Laura and I had been living since we'd arrived in Fairhaven. It wasn't a big house, but it had a small porch out front and a garden I was still trying to convince to survive my attempts at gardening. When I opened the gate, Sophie was already running toward Laura like they hadn't seen each other in months. Anne stayed a few steps back, watching them. She was wearing a light summer dress and simple sandals, quite different from the more formal image I'd pictured after hearing the town's stories. There was an ease about her that dismantled that idea of a distant, untouchable figure the gossip at the gate had suggested. "I hope we're not intruding on your Saturday," she said with a polite smile. "Not at all," I answered. "The house has been a science lab since Wednesday." She laughed quietly, glancing at the table full of materials visible through the kitchen window. Laura and Sophie were already arguing over how big the model should be and who'd be in charge of which part of the project. Kids have an impressive way of turning any school assignment into something that feels like a secret mission. Anne came inside with that polite curiosity of someone trying not to seem intrusive. She glanced quickly around the living room, at the photos on the shelf, at Laura's backpack dropped on the couch. "You just got here recently, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded. 2.5 weeks. She made a small affirming gesture, as if filing that piece of information away in some quiet train of thought. While the girls spread even more materials across the table, Anne offered to help cut some pieces of cardboard. We sat side by side in the kitchen, while Laura and Sophie hashed out project details like two seasoned engineers. Our conversation started off simple, almost automatic. Questions about school, about how Laura was adjusting to the new town, about work. I quickly discovered Anne had a very calm way of talking. She listened closely, asked direct questions, and didn't seem interested in filling the silence with unnecessary chatter. It was a rare quality. At one point, Laura asked for help cutting a thicker piece of cardboard, and Anne got up right away to help. As she leaned over the table explaining something to the girls, I noticed how comfortable she seemed in that kind of everyday moment. It was during one of those moments that Laura said something that made Anne and me exchange a quick glance. "Mom, can Sophie sleep over sometime?" she asked, not looking up from the model. Sophie immediately agreed, thrilled. Anne raised her eyebrows and looked at me, clearly surprised at how fast this friendship was moving. I shrugged, trying to look as calm as possible. They're deciding the entire future of this friendship in under a week. Anne sat back down beside me and let out a small, amused sigh. Kids are like that. They don't ask permission to like someone. There was a brief silence after that. It wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was more that natural pause that shows up when two people are starting to realize they're talking more easily than they expected. While the girls kept building the model, Anne glanced discreetly out the kitchen window, as if sizing up the street. Fairhaven can be a curious place for people who come from outside, she remarked. The way she chose the word curious had a faint note of tired humor. I rested my elbow on the table. I've already noticed the town likes to talk about people. She looked at me for a second longer than usual. She didn't seem surprised. In fact, she seemed like someone who'd already been expecting that observation. I imagine someone said something about me, she said, with a calm honesty that caught me off guard. I hesitated for a moment. Lying at that point would have felt too childish. They have, I admitted. Anne nodded slowly, like someone confirming something she already knew. But instead of seeming bothered, she just picked up a piece of cardboard and started cutting it carefully. Fairhaven likes stories, she said after a few seconds, and when it doesn't have all the facts, it makes up the rest. I watched her hands moving as she worked on the model. There was something curious about that moment. The woman the town described as someone to avoid was sitting in my kitchen helping two girls build a cardboard volcano for a science project. And for the first time since we'd arrived in town, I started to suspect that maybe Fairhaven was telling the wrong story. In the weeks that followed, Fairhaven started to feel less like a strange place to me. Not because the town had changed, but because my routine was starting to put down roots there. Laura woke up excited for school, talked about Sophie like they'd been friends since birth, and always had some new discovery from class to share. I watched all of it with that quiet relief only mothers understand when they see their kids settling in. The girls' friendship grew fast, almost inevitably. Sophie started showing up at our house after school a few times a week, and Laura started spending afternoons at hers too. It was funny to notice how the logistics of a kid's friendship naturally pulled the adults closer together. Anne and I started running into each other almost every day at the school gate, sometimes trading just a few quick words, other times talking longer while the girls took forever to finish some activity. As the days went by, I started noticing little things about Anne that didn't match the stories I'd been told at all. She didn't seem arrogant, or distant, or like someone who'd inspire fear. Quite the opposite. There was a serenity in the way she handled Sophie, a calm patience that reminded me a lot of the kind of mother I'd always tried to be for Laura. One afternoon, while we waited for the girls to get out of gym class, Anne said something that stayed with me the rest of the day. "They're inseparable already," she said, watching the field where the two of them chased a ball. I smiled. Kids have an amazing knack for deciding who gets to be part of their lives. Anne nodded slowly, like she was thinking about something deeper behind that simple sentence. There was a moment of silence between us as we watched them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was that kind of quiet pause that happens when two people are starting to get used to each other's presence. It was in that silence that I realized, without meaning to, I no longer saw Anne as just my daughter's friend's mother. She'd become someone whose company I genuinely enjoyed. A few days later, Laura invited Sophie over again for the afternoon. The two of them disappeared into her room almost as soon as they arrived, leaving the house strangely quiet. Anne and I stayed in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee between us. The conversation started with simple things: school, routines, work. But slowly, naturally, it went deeper. I found out Anne had grown up in Fairhaven, but had lived in other cities for years because of her ex-husband's career. When she came back after the divorce, she realized the town wasn't the place she remembered anymore. "Small towns have long memories," she said at one point, looking out the kitchen window. I understood what she meant without her needing to explain further. Fairhaven seemed like the kind of place where people's stories got tangled up with the town's own identity. And once someone decides on a narrative about you, that narrative tends to spread fast. Still, that particular afternoon, none of that seemed to matter much, because while we talked in the kitchen, Laura and Sophie were in the bedroom, laughing about something that only made sense to the two of them. The sound of that kid laughter carried through the whole house and created a sense of normalcy I hadn't felt in a long time. When Anne left that evening, I noticed something curious. I was already looking forward to the next time we'd see each other. It wasn't something I'd planned, or something I'd consciously decided. It was just that light feeling that her presence was already becoming part of the new routine I was building in Fairhaven. And maybe the strangest part of all was realizing that, little by little, I was starting to stop caring about the warnings the town had given me about her. It was on a Friday afternoon that I realized our routine had already passed that invisible point where two people stop being just acquaintances. Laura and Sophie had a rehearsal for the school's spring showcase, and parents were invited to watch at the end. The gym was full of folding chairs, kids running everywhere, and that lively noise that always comes with school events. Anne arrived a few minutes after me and sat down in the chair beside mine, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She'd brought 2 small bottles of juice and handed me one without ceremony. "Figured you might want one," she said with a small smile. It was a simple gesture, but somehow it felt like it was saying our friendship had already moved past that early, formal stage. While we waited for the rehearsal to start, I began noticing something curious in the air around us. Some people were glancing discreetly in our direction. It wasn't blatant, but it was noticeable. Fairhaven had that kind of quiet attention that spreads without anyone needing to say a word out loud. Anne noticed before I did. She tilted her head slightly, scanning the gym like someone already familiar with that kind of reaction. Then she looked back at me and gave an almost amused smile. "You noticing?" she asked quietly. "The looks?" I answered. She nodded. "Fairhaven likes to keep up with a story," she said, resting her elbow on the arm of her chair. I couldn't help a small laugh. "I imagine this town has plenty of material when it comes to you." Anne turned to face me. She didn't look offended, just tired of a subject that had been rehashed too many times. "You've probably heard a few versions already," she said. I hesitated for a second. I didn't want to seem nosy, but I also didn't want to pretend the subject didn't exist. "I've heard some things," I admitted. She nodded slowly, like someone confirming something predictable. "And you decided to keep talking to me anyway." The way she said it wasn't accusatory. It was almost curious. "Maybe because I'd rather form my own opinions," I answered. Anne stayed quiet for a few seconds. She didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. In the middle of the gym floor, Laura and Sophie came running out with the rest of the class, lining up to start the rehearsal. The two of them found each other immediately in the crowd and started whispering something that made them both laugh. "Those two found each other awfully fast," Anne remarked, watching them. "Some people just have that gift," I answered. She turned her face slightly toward me, and for a second, we just sat there, looking at each other. There was something different about that moment. A quiet closeness that hadn't been there a few weeks before. The rehearsal began, and the gym's attention turned to the kids. Children's music echoed through the speakers while rows of students tried to follow the choreography. Laura and Sophie were clearly more interested in laughing at each other than in getting the steps right. Anne leaned in a little closer to me to comment on the girls' clumsy dancing. It was a small gesture, but in that instant, I noticed something curious. Her perfume was soft, barely there, and the unexpected closeness made my heart react in a way I wasn't expecting. I shifted a few inches away in my chair, pretending to adjust my position. Anne noticed. I was sure of it. But she didn't say anything. She just looked back at the gym floor, as if giving that strange moment room to pass without any awkwardness. The rehearsal ended with applause and a burst of kids running across the gym again. Laura and Sophie came straight toward us, both talking at once about how they'd nailed most of the choreography. Anne stood up to hug her daughter, and I did the same with Laura. For a second, our hands touched as we both tried to sort out the girls' backpacks. It was a quick touch, accidental, but something about that simple gesture kept humming in the air between us. Anne looked up at me at the exact same moment. Neither of us said anything, but in that silent moment, For the first time, I had the clear feeling our story was starting to head somewhere neither of us had planned. A few weeks after that rehearsal, Fairhaven no longer felt like just the backdrop for a fresh start. The town was becoming part of my routine in a way I hadn't expected. Laura kept adjusting better and better to school, had already been invited to 2 classmates' birthday parties, and seemed to have decided Sophie was officially her best friend. I watched that friendship bloom with a quiet kind of gratitude that only shows up when you realize your kids are building a safe place for themselves in the world. The natural consequence was that Anne and I spent more and more time together. Not because we'd planned it, but because the girls' schedules practically demanded it. There were school projects, after-school club activities, afternoons at the park, and little impromptu chats at the school gate that kept turning into longer conversations than expected. It was on one of those afternoons that something changed. The school put on a small cultural fair at the end of a Friday. The kids were buzzing about performances, project displays, and booths set up in the courtyard. Laura and Sophie disappeared together as soon as we arrived, promising to be back before their class's performance started. Anne and I walked between the booths, checking out the students' projects and chatting about little details of how the event was organized. There was music playing in the background, parents chatting in groups, and that easygoing atmosphere typical of school events. At one point, we stopped near a table displaying some of the students' models. One of them was the very same cardboard volcano Laura and Sophie had built weeks earlier. It leaned a little crooked, covered in paint smudges, clearly made with more enthusiasm than technical skill. Even so, the 2 of them had put a little name card next to it. Anne looked at the model and smiled. "They were so proud of this," she said. "They spent 3 whole afternoons arguing about how tall the volcano should be," I answered. Anne let out a small laugh. "That explains the absurd amount of red paint." We stood there a few seconds looking at the model, like 2 people who both knew that simple object carried a lot more meaning than it seemed. Then we kept walking through the courtyard. At some point, we ended up drifting a little away from the busier part of the event. There was a small side path that led to the school parking lot, lit only by a few lampposts. Anne stopped there for a moment, leaning lightly against the wooden railing that separated the path from the lawn. I stopped beside her. From where we stood, we could still hear the music and the noise of people back in the courtyard, but the spot felt quieter. "Sometimes I forget how intense these events can be," she said. "Because of people?" I asked. Anne nodded. Fairhaven never misses a chance to watch. I knew exactly what she meant. "Do you get used to it?" I asked. She stared at the empty parking lot for a few seconds before answering. "Not really." There was a brief silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just full of thought. Anne turned her face slightly toward me. The light from the lamppost lit part of her face, casting soft shadows over the rest of her expression. "And you?" she asked, "still getting used to the town?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Actually, I think I'm starting to like it." She raised an eyebrow. "Even after whatever warnings they must have given you?" I gave a small smile, especially after realizing this town doesn't tell every story right. Anne kept looking at me for a second longer than usual. Something shifted in her expression in that moment. It was like some invisible wall was starting to come down. "You're brave," she said. I shook my head slightly. "No, just curious." She laughed softly, and that's when I realized how close we were standing to each other. It wasn't a planned closeness. It just happened. Anne leaned in slightly, like she was about to say something, but the words didn't come. The silence between us seemed to carry a question neither of us was ready to put into words. My heart started racing in a way that caught me completely off guard. I knew exactly what was happening, and at the same time, I had no idea what to do with it. Anne seemed to notice too. She took a deep breath, glancing quickly at the lit-up courtyard before looking back at me. For a second, I had the impression she was making a quiet decision. Then she took a small step toward me. It was a simple gesture, but enough to close the distance between us. When she finally leaned in and her lips touched mine, the kiss happened with an unexpected calm. There was no rush, no hesitation. Just that strange, powerful feeling that something important was beginning right at that moment. It lasted only a few seconds. But when we pulled back, the world felt slightly different. Anne ran a hand through her hair, clearly trying to gather her thoughts. "That was better than I expected," she murmured. I couldn't help a small smile. "Same here." From the schoolyard, we heard Laura and Sophie calling our names. Reality came rushing back. Anne and I traded one last look before walking back toward the light and noise of the event. But something inside me knew that after that kiss, neither of us would be able to pretend our story was still just the friendship between two mothers waiting at the school gate.
Quick pause before we keep going. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to know I think there's a lot more waiting for you on my Patreon, Ko. Exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Longer chapters, extra scenes, and all the little details that make these characters and their moments feel even more real. Everything you need is linked right below. Okay, back to the story.
After that night at the fair, I spent the whole weekend with the strange feeling that something delicate had been placed at the center of my life. It wasn't just the kiss itself. It was everything that came with it. The awareness that Anne and I now occupied a different space in each other's lives. One where simple things, like waiting at the school gate, were starting to carry new meaning. On Saturday morning, Laura woke up way too early and showed up in the kitchen still in her pajamas, asking if Sophie could come play again. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unusual, but because at that moment I was still trying to sort out my own feelings. Still, I told her we could plan something during the week. Laura seemed satisfied with that promise and went back to her room, talking to herself about some secret plan that probably involved paint, cardboard, and grand ideas. For the rest of the day, I tried to act normal. I tidied the house, graded a few school tests, and went to the store to buy things we didn't really need. It was the simplest way I found to keep my mind occupied. Even so, I kept catching myself remembering the way Anne had leaned in at the parking lot, the quiet pause before the kiss, the way she'd seemed both determined and vulnerable at the same time. On Monday, when I dropped Laura off at school, my heart raced as I got closer to the gate. Part of me had no idea how to act when I saw Anne again. Another part just wanted to confirm that it hadn't been an isolated moment, the kind two people pretend to forget the next day. Anne arrived a few minutes later. When her car pulled up in front of the school, I noticed something right away. People around us seemed to be watching a little more closely than usual. Maybe it was just my imagination. Or maybe Fairhaven really had started noticing something. She got out of the car and walked up to the gate with Sophie beside her. When our eyes met, there was a small moment of quiet recognition between us. It wasn't awkwardness. It was more like two people who both knew they shared a recent secret. "Morning," she said. "Morning." The girls disappeared quickly into the school, leaving Anne and me alone for a few seconds at the gate. For a moment I thought maybe we'd talk about the kiss, about what it meant, about what was supposed to happen now. But Anne did something unexpected. She started talking about the spring showcase happening the following week. It was a completely ordinary conversation. And maybe that's exactly why it was comforting. As we talked, I noticed a few glances around us again. Two mothers standing nearby stopped their conversation when Anne got close. A father walking past the gate gave me a quick nod, hello, but completely ignored her presence. That's when I understood something I'd only suspected before. Fairhaven didn't just tell stories about Anne. The town also knew exactly how to treat her like someone who was supposed to stay on the margins. Anne seemed used to it. She talked to me with the same calm as always, as if the looks and silences around us didn't matter. But now I was seeing all of it with different eyes, and it bothered me. After we said goodbye and I headed to work, that feeling stayed with me for the rest of the morning. There was something deeply unfair about the way people reacted to her presence, as if some collective narrative had already decided who Anne was, and nobody else was interested in hearing another version. At pickup that same day, Laura and Sophie came running up again, talking about a new class project. The two of them were already planning another assignment together, tossing around ideas like a couple of little architects. Anne and I walked a few yards down the sidewalk while the girls ran ahead. "Did you notice?" I finally asked. "The looks?" she answered, without hesitation. I nodded. She shrugged lightly. "That's been happening ever since I moved back to Fairhaven." I stopped walking. Anne took 2 more steps before noticing and turning around. "You shouldn't have to deal with this because of me," she said. There was sincerity in that sentence, maybe even a certain exhaustion. But for the first time since we'd arrived in town, I had a different reaction than people probably expected. "Maybe the problem isn't you," I answered. Anne looked at me in silence. The girls were a few yards ahead, discussing something about their next school project. The afternoon was calm, the sun starting to dip behind the trees lining the street. And in that moment, I realized something with unexpected clarity. Fairhaven could have all the opinions it wanted about Anne, but for the first time since I'd arrived in this town, I knew exactly what mine was. That same week, something happened that changed the way I saw Fairhaven, and also the way I started to understand Anne's story. It wasn't some dramatic revelation, the kind that comes out in a single intense conversation. It was something quieter, more human, built up gradually, like puzzle pieces finally starting to fit together. Laura had been invited to sleep over at Sophie's on a Friday. The two of them spent the whole week talking about it like it was a historic event. I dropped Laura off at Anne's early in the evening, after promising I'd be back the next day to pick her up. The girls disappeared down the hallway immediately, backpacks, pajamas, and an impressive amount of excitement in tow. Anne invited me in before I left. It was the first time I'd been in her house at night. The house was big, but not in a showy way. There were books on the shelves, toys scattered discreetly in a corner of the living room, and framed photos on a side table near the stairs. Some showed Sophie at different ages. Others looked like old travel pictures. There was also a photo of Anne, much younger, standing next to a man I recognized immediately, the mayor. Anne noticed me looking before I could even say anything. "That one was taken a long time ago," she said, walking over to the shelf. There was a brief silence. I didn't want to seem intrusive, but I also didn't want to pretend that part of her story didn't exist. "Were you two married long?" I asked carefully. Anne rested a hand on the edge of the table before answering. "Almost 12 years. 12 years. That was long enough to build an entire life with someone." "And Sophie?" I asked. "She was 7 when we separated." The way Anne said it was calm, but there was something deeper behind that composure. We stood in silence in the living room for a few seconds. The soft lamplight cast long shadows on the walls, and upstairs you could hear the girls laughing about something in the bedroom. "Fairhaven has a very specific version of that story," I remarked. Anne gave a small, humorless smile. "I imagine so." She walked over to the kitchen and opened a bottle of water. When she came back, she looked like she'd made a quiet decision. "Do you want to know what really happened?" The question caught me by surprise, but I knew I was ready to hear it. Anne sat on the arm of the couch before continuing. "When I met Edward, he wasn't mayor yet. He was just an ambitious lawyer who talked a lot about changing the town." She paused briefly, like she was revisiting old memories. "At first, everything seemed really promising. I listened without interrupting. Over time, politics became everything. Anne searched for the right word before continuing. Image, control, influence. Every decision had to look perfect for the public. She looked down at her own hands. And I was part of that image. There was a raw honesty in the way she spoke. When Sophie was born, I started to realize that life wasn't exactly what I wanted for her. Anne looked up again. But for someone who'd built an entire career on image and power, a divorce isn't just a personal matter. It's a public scandal, I finished. Anne nodded. The simplest thing was to let the town believe I was the one to blame. That hit me in a way I didn't expect. You never tried to explain? She let out a light sigh. Explain what? That the marriage ended because I didn't want to live inside a political project? I stayed quiet. The cruel logic of the situation was starting to become clear. Fairhaven picked the easy story, Anne went on, and easy stories tend to stick around longer. Upstairs, the girls started running down the hallway, probably in the middle of some improvised game. The sound of their laughter carried through the whole house. Anne looked toward the stairs with a soft smile. I don't really care much what this town thinks of me, she said. But there was something in the way she said it that suggested it wasn't entirely true. I got up slowly from the couch. I care, I said. Anne looked up at me. About what? About the fact that the story they're telling about you isn't the real one. She studied me for a few seconds, like she was weighing that statement. Then she gave a small, almost disbelieving smile. You've been in Fairhaven a few weeks, she said. Long enough to recognize when someone's being judged unfairly. There was a long silence between us. It wasn't heavy. It was just full of meaning. Upstairs, Laura and Sophie started singing some made-up song, completely off-key. Anne laughed. And in that instant, I realized something with total clarity. I'd come to Fairhaven trying to rebuild my life. But without noticing, I'd already started defending someone the whole town had decided to abandon. After that conversation at Anne's house, I drove home with a strange sense of clarity. Some stories need to be heard straight from the person who lived them, because by the time they pass through enough mouths, they lose their original shape. Driving through Fairhaven's quiet streets that night, I thought about how many times the town had probably repeated the easiest version of her divorce. The version that didn't require reflection, or empathy, or doubt. On Saturday morning, I went back to pick up Laura. The two girls were in the kitchen finishing pancakes clearly made with more enthusiasm than skill. Anne stood leaning against the counter, watching them with that calm smile I was already starting to recognize from across a room. "Morning," she said when I walked in. "Morning." Laura ran over to hug me before going back to the table to recount everything that had happened the night before. Sophie filled in the story with exaggerated details while the two of them talked over each other. Anne and I exchanged an amused look, already used to that chaotic energy. After we finished coffee, the girls disappeared into the backyard to play while Anne and I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up. There was something comfortable about that kind of everyday moment. Like our lives were slowly finding a shared rhythm. But that Saturday's calm wouldn't last long. The following Monday, the school held an open meeting for parents. It was a presentation about the semester's projects and some changes to the extracurricular schedule. Nothing too remarkable, at least at first glance. The auditorium was packed by the time I arrived. Anne was seated a few rows ahead with Sophie. Laura ran straight over to sit next to her friend, leaving the two of us in the parents' section. I sat down next to Anne. The meeting started normally. Teachers talking about the class's progress, coordinators explaining new teaching approaches, parents asking predictable questions about schedules and homework, until the auditorium door opened. The shift in the room was immediate. The mayor walked in, flanked by two aides, and made his way to the front row with the confidence of someone used to taking up space without asking permission. I'd never met Edward Whitfield in person before, only seen him in photos and local news coverage. He was a tall man, polished in appearance, with a carefully controlled expression. the kind of person who always seems aware of his own image. When he walked down the center aisle, the looks in the auditorium shifted. Some people straightened up in their seats. Others whispered discreetly. Anne didn't move. But I caught the exact instant her shoulders went slightly rigid. The mayor sat down in the front row and slowly turned his head, as if taking stock of who was present. That's when his eyes found Anne. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make the air in the room feel heavier. There was no dramatic expression, no exaggerated reaction, just a long, calculating look. Anne kept her posture perfectly neutral. After a few seconds, he looked away and turned his attention back to the meeting. But the mood had shifted. I noticed. Anne noticed. Probably half the room noticed too. The meeting went on, but the focus wasn't the same. At one point, one of the coordinators invited the mayor to say a few words about the town's support for the school. Edward stood up with ease, walking to the front like someone who'd done that kind of thing hundreds of times. He talked about education, about investing in the town's future, about the importance of the school community. It was a well-crafted speech. But as he spoke, I noticed something odd. At one point, his eyes drifted back toward our row. And this time, it wasn't only Anne he was looking at. He looked directly at me. It wasn't a hostile look. It was something colder. Like he was mentally filing away a new piece of information. When the meeting ended, people started getting up slowly. Laura and Sophie came running over to us, chattering excitedly about some part of the presentation they'd completely misunderstood. Anne grabbed her daughter's backpack while I helped Laura organize the papers she'd brought from the classroom. That's when I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up. The mayor was standing a few feet away from us. Anne noticed at the same moment. She turned slowly. "Evening, Anne," he said, with a warmth that felt carefully rehearsed. "Evening, Edward." The formality between them was almost surgical. His eyes shifted toward me again. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure," he said. Anne answered before I could say anything. "This is Claire, Laura's mother." There was a brief pause. He held out his hand. "Edward Whitfield." I shook his hand politely. "Nice to meet you." The smile he gave was perfectly polite, but there was something behind it. Something that felt like a quiet assessment. After a few seconds, he said his goodbyes and headed toward the auditorium exit. When the door closed behind him, I noticed Anne staring at the floor for a moment. "You okay?" I asked. She looked up again. "I'm fine." But there was something different in her expression. And in that moment, I realized our story had just entered much more complicated territory than just Fairhaven's whispers. After that school meeting, Fairhaven felt a little smaller to me. Not physically, of course. The streets were still the same. The square was still in the same spot. The white church still dominated downtown. But there was a new feeling in the air, like the invisible lines connecting people in that community had shifted slightly. In the days that followed, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. The looks at the school gate weren't just curious anymore. Some were clearly evaluating. It wasn't open hostility, but that quiet attention a small town pays when it thinks it's watching a new chapter of an old story unfold. Anne kept acting the same as always. Calm, elegant, giving no sign that it bothered her. But I already knew her well enough to catch the small details. The way her eyes swept the surroundings quickly when she arrived at school. The way her smile tightened slightly when certain people walked by without greeting her. Laura and Sophie, on the other hand, kept living in a completely different universe. For them, the world came down to school projects, games at the park, and grand plans to build an imaginary treehouse in someone's backyard. And maybe it was exactly that simplicity that ended up pushing us toward the final decision. The following Friday, the school held the kids' spring showcase. It was one of those events that draws out half the town. Parents, grandparents, Siblings, teachers, all gathered in the school's lit-up courtyard. Chairs were set up in rows facing a small makeshift stage. Colored lights decorated the trees around it, and the chatter mixed with soft music playing in the background. Laura and Sophie were in the second row of students taking part in the performance. Anne and I sat together, like it had already become our habit. For a while, it all felt like just another school event. The performances began. Kids reciting poems, small groups singing simple songs, teachers trying to keep some order amid all the excitement. Until I felt the mood shift again. I didn't need to look back to know what was happening. Still, I turned my head. The mayor had arrived. He walked between the chairs, greeting a few people as he looked for a seat. When he found a spot a few rows behind us, he paused for a moment. I knew he was watching. Not the stage. Us. Anne noticed too. Her shoulders tensed slightly. For a few minutes we pretended to focus on the kid's performance, but there was something in the air that made it impossible to ignore his presence there. Then something unexpected happened. Laura and Sophie walked onto the stage with their class. The two of them were holding hands. When the music started, they took their spots in the center of the row and began singing along with their classmates. It was a simple scene. 2 9-year-old girls smiling on stage, completely unaware of the complicated stories the adults were carrying. Anne watched Sophie with a soft expression. I watched Laura trying to remember the choreography. And in that moment, I had a very clear feeling. Life rarely waits until you're fully ready to make important decisions. Sometimes it just puts 2 people in the same place, over and over, until ignoring what's happening becomes impossible. When the song ended and the crowd started applauding, Laura and Sophie ran off the stage. The 2 of them came straight toward us. Anne stood to hug her daughter. I did the same with Laura. The girls started talking at once, telling us how nervous they'd been before going on stage. That's when I felt that look again, coming from the rows behind us. I looked up. The mayor was watching. There was no smile on his face, just that cold, calculating expression. Anne noticed too. For a second, I saw something in her eyes I recognized right away. Exhaustion. Not just from that night. From whole years spent living under the town's silent judgment. And that's when I made a decision. There was no speech. No dramatic announcement. I just reached out my hand. Anne looked at it for a second. Then she looked up at me. There was a silent question in that look. And maybe a little fear too. But there was something stronger there too. Trust. She put her hand in mine. And for the first time since arriving at the showcase, she didn't look away from anyone around us. Laura and Sophie kept chattering excitedly about the performance, completely unaware of the small gesture happening between us. Some people noticed. Others pretended not to. But for the first time since I'd arrived in Fairhaven, that didn't seem to matter so much anymore. Because in that moment, I understood something very simple. I'd come to this town trying to rebuild my life. But sometimes, rebuilding doesn't mean going back to how things were. Sometimes it means finding someone who shows you there's still room to start something completely new. Some things change slowly, almost without making a sound. By the time I noticed, 6 months had passed since that spring showcase. Winter had already settled over Fairhaven, bringing that light chill that made mornings feel quieter. Laura and Sophie were still inseparable. But the truth is, it wasn't just the 2 of them anymore. Anne and I had also learned to build a routine together. At first, everything was very careful. After the kiss that night at the fair, and that moment at the school event when we held hands in front of everyone, there was a feeling that we were stepping into new territory. Neither of us wanted to ruin it, but neither of us wanted to pretend it wasn't happening either. The first few weeks were made up of small gestures. Long coffees after dropping the girls off at school. Simple texts throughout the day. Walks in the park with the girls running ahead while we walked side by side. And glances. So many glances. the kind that say things that haven't found the courage to become words yet. The first kiss after that night happened in a much less dramatic way, and a much more real one. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Laura and Sophie were in the backyard trying to build a tree house that clearly had zero chance of staying upright. Anne and I were in the kitchen. I was cutting up fruit for the girls' snack when I felt her presence come up behind me. "Did you notice they're using duct tape to hold branches to the tree?" she said. I laughed. Experimental architecture. Anne stopped next to me at the counter. For a second, we just stood there, looking out the window at the two of them in the yard. Then I felt her hand touch my arm lightly. It was a simple gesture, but full of intention. When I turned my face, Anne was watching me with that calm expression I'd already learned to recognize. No rush, no fear. She leaned in first this time. The kiss was slow, much longer than the first, and completely different. There was no surprise. There was choice. When we pulled apart, Anne let out a small laugh. "I've been wanting to do that for days," she confessed. "Me too." After that, things started falling into place naturally. There were no big announcements, no dramatic conversations, just a quiet understanding that we were building something together. The girls figured it out before they even had to ask. One day, while we were walking in the park, Laura looked at me and asked, "You like Sophie's mom, don't you?" I stopped walking for a second. "I do." She thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. "Me too." And she went back to running with Sophie like it was the most normal thing in the world. Maybe it was. Fairhaven kept watching, but the town didn't feel so powerful anymore, because real life was happening inside our routine. In simple Tuesday dinners, in movie nights when the girls fell asleep on the couch, in lazy Sundays when Anne showed up with coffee and fresh bread from the bakery, and in the quiet moments when I realized I wasn't rebuilding my life alone anymore. One cold January night, we sat on the porch after the girls had gone to bed. The sky was clear, full of stars. Anne held my hand. "Funny," she said. "What?" "They told you to stay away from me." I laughed. "They did." She turned to face me. "And you didn't." I shook my head. "No." Anne leaned in and kissed me again, with that steady calm that now felt like part of who we were. When we pulled back, she rested her head on my shoulder. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Fairhaven, I felt like the whole town could keep telling whatever story it wanted. Because the only story that really mattered was happening right there, between the two of us. And it had started in the most unexpected way possible, with two 9-year-old girls who decided to become friends on the very first day of school,